Howdy do, neighbor. It's Berean Spirits time once again. The boys have gathered around and they're ready for you. So join in, make comments, and study with the guys as they try to study as the Bereans did in Acts chapter 17. And now, here's the guys.
Welcome back to another episode of Berean Spirits. My name is Chris Peltz. I'm the evangelist with the Southside Church of Christ in beautiful, rainy, cloudy, thundery Springfield, Missouri. We've got Richard Dodson up in Kearney, Missouri with the Kearney Church of Christ. Richard, you doing all right today, brother?
Yeah, we were supposed to get some of that rain, but it went south on us.
Yep.
At the last second. They said it was going to follow I-70, or I woke up at 4 o'clock.
Yeah.
They said it was going to follow I-70, and all of a sudden, there it went, south of us.
Yep. Well, went through Josh's area in the middle of the night. Josh Thornhill with the West Side Church of Christ over in Wichita, Kansas. You kept you up all night, didn't it?
Not all night, but it did.
Thunder scare you?
It was coming through in the middle of the night. And I don't think we just were kind of on the very outskirts of it. It just kind of almost really passed right by us. But still, you never know with those kind of weather systems, I guess.
Yeah. A lot of high wind, a lot of hail. That's pretty much been the story over the past few weeks for us. So getting lots of rain, but
It's spring.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. But now just south of you is where all the tornadoes have been hitting.
Yep. Yeah, we've been in the midst of a bunch of flooding and different things like that. But we're doing good in this area. Like most everything's been east of us, so the way it goes.
Have you done any fishing down there?
So some crappie fishing.
I thought the white bass were supposed to be hitting.
Oh yeah, that run's about done. They've been pretty good, but no, I didn't get to that this year.
See, I see all those boats in that marina behind you. I figured you'd gotten on one and, went fishing.
Yeah. Just some crappie fishing up at Truman Lake.
Really? You went all the way up there?
Yep.
Long way to go.
Yep. Good crappie, though.
Why not Stockton Lake or,
Well, because I'm not driving and I'm just along for the ride.
Good reason.
That's
Table,
right.
Table Rock has good crappie.
Do they?
Yep.
Yeah. I'm sure they probably do.
Bull Shoals.
Yeah.
I've caught their crappie. I've been at Bull Shoals before.
Mm-hmm.
Fishing crappie.
Oh, yeah.
So.
Yep. Well,
I couldn't have found a closer spot. I mean, what's that? Like a 2-hour drive for you guys?
A little over an hour.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I guess it's probably about the same if you went to Bull Shows. So I don't know. When you get the windy roads.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah.
Well, I guess our fishing show's over.
Yeah, I guess so. All right, let's get into some Old Testament stuff. One of the things that we've been doing here on Wednesday nights, one of our class teachers, Russell, he's been teaching, going through the Old Testament and showing how it points to the New Testament. And so I thought it's an interesting class because there's some applications that I certainly hadn't thought of in times past or been reminded of during this class, but it's also brought to mind some really interesting and really fun passages, at least for me, in thinking about the New Testament applications and things that we can learn from the Old Testament, because the Old Testament entirely is intended to bring us to the New Testament, right? I mean that it all points to Christ. It's like Babe Ruth right? When he would go up to the plate and he would point to, where he was going to hit his next home run, calling his shot. And that's what the Old Testament is God calling his shots, and all pointing to Christ and saying that this is what this is leading to. This is where I'm headed you to. This is where your focus needs to be. If you watch, this is exactly where it's all headed. This is where it's going. And there's lots of great passages in the Old Testament, and I think we've all got our favorites. We've all got some things that we love. Old Testament books as a whole. I love the book of Jeremiah, for example. But let's talk about some of our favorite Old Testament passages, guys, and maybe how they point to how we live in Christ, or how they point to being revealed in the New Testament. So I don't know if you guys have anything particular. Josh, you have one that really stands out, maybe more than others?
Well, I mean, there's obviously a whole bunch that we could do.
Oh man, there's a ton. Yeah, we got the whole book, or the whole covenant.
It's interesting though. I'm teaching through the Gospel of John right now, and you see this discussion there in John chapter 1, and we're going to go back to the Old Testament, I promise. But one of the things that John is doing in the gospel is, pointing to John the Baptist, and pointing, the emphasizing that he's pointing to Jesus too. Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. Or when they ask him who he is, he says, I'm not the Christ. Are you Elijah? Nope. Are you the prophet? No. And so he's always pointing people to Jesus. And then he talks about in verse 32, I have beheld the Spirit descending as a dove out of heaven, and he abided on him. And I did not know him, but he who sent me to baptize with water said to me, the one upon whom you see the Spirit descending up and abiding on him, this is the one who baptizes with the Holy Spirit. And I myself have seen and have borne witness that this is the Son of God. And so he was somehow told, God told him that the one that you see the Spirit descending upon is the Son of God, or is the one that you're looking for. Essentially, he's the one you're preparing the way for. And so John looks and he sees that, or notices or acknowledges that Jesus is the one that he's witnessed, and he's recognized that he is the Son of God. Now, there is some discussion amongst scholars as far as the Son of God there. Some assert that what Jesus or John is saying there is that this is the chosen one. And so maybe the better rendering is not so much the Son of God, but the chosen one. And so I think there's an interesting connection there in Isaiah 42, because in verse 1 of Isaiah 42, he says, behold my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen one, in whom I am well pleased. If you recall, when Jesus is baptized, the Spirit descends upon him like a dove, but the Father says, this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. And so this seems to be a connection to that idea, and because he says, my chosen one, in whom my soul is well pleased, I have put my Spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. He will not cry out or raise his voice, nor make his voice heard in the street. A crushed reed he will not break. Verse 4, he says, until he has established justice in the earth, and the coastlands will wait expectantly for his law. It very much seems to be pointing towards this servant, the chosen one. And I think that perhaps there is a connection there between the baptism of Jesus and the Spirit descending upon him, and God acknowledging to the world, this is my chosen one. And particularly through John, as John says, this is the one that I've been sent to prepare the way for. So that's kind of one of the first ones that come to mind, because it's more recent in my memory because of the class that I've been doing. But
right. And man, there's just, again, like we said, there's so many, and the prophets are full of it, right? I mean, they are always pointing to Christ. There's this dual fulfillment, oftentimes a physical and a spiritual. But Richard, what what's first of all, Rick, do you have a favorite Old Testament book as a whole? Just out of curiosity.
Boy, I never thought about it like that.
Yeah.
I'd have to give that some thought.
Okay. All right. That's
And
kind of a side
if I
question
did,
anyway.
it would change.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Yeah, mine's been pretty steady for the most part with Jeremiah, but anyway, go ahead. What's something though as far as our discussion today?
Well, I guess it really depends on what aspect of the Old Testament you want to talk about, because First Corinthians 10 tells us about the purpose of the Old Testament is for us to learn from their mistakes. And every time they did something wrong, they were supposed to learn from it. And so that's one aspect, is to take, some of the stories and to see their mistakes. You might find something similar that you might had a problem with, and you're thinking, hey, if that was their judgment, what should be my judgment? So I mean, that's one aspect. And another aspect is kind of what Josh was getting into, is the prophecies, the things that showed us Christ beforehand. And that's another aspect that I enjoy of the Old Testament, is to see those things. And here recently, I preached on Daniel chapter 2, and got into the vision, or the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, and how it showed at the end, it foresaw the coming of the Lord's kingdom, which is the church, and how you can use Daniel 2 to make that point, being that it would have come during the time of the Roman Empire. And that's kind of neat. I like looking at those kind of passages. And then the third one, it goes along, and this is probably, if you had to push me, my favorite aspect of it is the First Peter 3:21 stuff. The type, anti-type, and I think that gets into what you were talking about earlier, Chris. And a lady asked me this at church here the other day, and I started getting into, she wanted to know what good the Old Testament was to us, and I got into these things. But the one that I told her I'd probably do a lesson on, which I have in the past, I thought she heard it, but the type, anti-type, which is kind of a shadow of the reality that you talked about, Chris. I like to call it the Old Testament as the New Testament illustrated. It kind of, it's like the pictures of what we're being told to do in the New Testament, and we can see examples of it. But one of my favorite type, anti-types, and what I mean by shadow, what we mean by that is, where you have a comparison made of something that's a reality in the future, and which is kind of, Chris, getting back to what Chris got into. One of my favorite ones, and of course in First Peter 3:21, he's talking about the flood, but I won't use that one. The one that I like is when the children of Israel were leaving Egypt, and they had to walk across the Red Sea, and the Lord parted the waters. They went across on dry ground, and then they came up on the other side. Of course, the waters destroyed Pharaoh's soldiers, and that's a good illustration of baptism, because what the Israelites were escaping was bondage to Pharaoh. And what the Christian is trying, they're escaping is bondage to sin. And in both cases, the Israelites had to go under the water, and the Christian has to go under the water in baptism, according to Romans 6. He comes up on the other side, a new man who has been freed from bondage, the bondage of sin. The Israelites came up on the other side, and of course, they were now freed from the bondage to Pharaoh. And I just, those kind of passages, this is one that I really enjoy, to be able to show people how the Lord was pointing away to baptism. and not just with this, but with many other illustrations as well. But this is a big one to me. This is the one that just stands out, where there's a type anti-type which you can go to and show people and say, look, this is what the Israelites did. This is what we have to do. And it's it's just the bondage is different. That we are in bondage to sin, they're in bondage to Pharaoh, and so that's one of the passages I like to go to.
I would be curious to try and get a count of all the ways we can use Moses and the events that you described and others that we could look to and point out, pointing to Christ, because from the very beginning of Moses' life, right, he was drawn out of the water, right, and in essence saved, right, being drawn out of the water, being the way he was called, all of those things really would be the shadows of things that we are in the substance of. And one thing after another, the old law, right, which could not lead the Jews into the promised land. Moses wasn't able to lead them into the promised land. And so Joshua came. Interestingly enough, Joshua and Jesus, as far as the names are concerned, but the prophet who would come after, as Moses talked about, which would be Jesus. I mean, just time and time and time again, we see, as far as Moses is concerned, all of those things that lead to and point to Christ, the Passover, right? In doing that, and Jesus is our Passover. Um, Moses knowing both sides as far as Pharaoh and the Hebrews, Jesus knowing both sides as far as God and man. I just over and over again we see those being brought out just within that context, right? Not even getting into all the other Old Testament passages and books. There is just a plethora of things just right there with Moses. And one of my favorite, in fact, is Exodus 17, when they are going against Shechem and the men there, where Moses tells Joshua to go and fight, and Moses gets up in an advantage viewpoint, and as he holds up his hands, Joshua is successful, but as he begins to grow weak, and anyone who's held their hands above their head for a very long period of time knows how difficult that in and of itself can be. And then what we have there is Joshua doing his part, Moses doing his part, and then here comes Aaron and Hur, who not only get a stone for Moses to lean up or prop up against, but then also grab his hands and hold him up, so that Joshua and the army can be successful. And I look at that text and I think, how we work together as Christians, as God's people. Here is, someone holding up their hands, trying to, encourage and give us the strength that we need. And yet we need help ourselves, right? As preachers, for example, we need, members of the congregation to come along and lift up our hands and hold them up, so that, not only we can accomplish our goal, but those around us can receive the encouragement and strength and accomplish their goals. And so there's just so much in the Old Testament that we see, but all of it again points to Christ and the church. I mean, that's what it's there. What we see as far as who God is, what God has done, and what God expects of his people is all bore out in the New Testament. And without the New Testament, there's so much of the New Testament that just doesn't make any sense at all. And so it's definitely, there for our learning, as you pointed out, Richard.
It shows God's wisdom.
Absolutely.
And it's an amazing wisdom. I mean, when you, it's really hard. Somebody who has no knowledge of the Bible, you wish that you could impart this, but I haven't figured out a way to do that in a way that that somebody could readily take it in and say, wow, I got to know more about this. Because when you look at the overwhelming um, evidence of these stories that, like Chris has said, and I said, Josh said, then you're left with there's no way this can be a hoax. There's just no way man could have wrote this over all these period of years, because the story and how the stories come together for all these different purposes. I mean, it just blows your mind. I mean, and so for anybody to try to say, well, the Bible is just written by men, it was a hoax, they don't understand the Bible. If you really looked at some of the things we're talking about, and if you looked at how the Old Testament and the New Testament come together for all these different purposes that I stated, then there's just no way. There's no way possible men over that many years could have conspired to come and had that type of wisdom to make it come together like that. That's an unbelievable thing. But yet that's what we have with the Bible. The Bible, if you know the complete message, then you're left with, there's nothing you can say other than this is the word of God. And if this is the word of God, then it most definitely is a creator. He most definitely is God. There most definitely is the Son of God. And then all the things that he discloses in his word are definitely true.
Mhm.
And that would be that Jesus is coming again. And so, the only way I know how somebody can get to that point is to actually sit down and seek God through the Bible. They're going to have to spend some time looking through the Bible. And when you come to that point, you are a blessed man, because now you have seen, the plan of God. And that is, like I said, that's a very hard thing for any man to be able to explain to somebody in a 2 or 3 minute setting.
Yeah, I think there are 40 writers over a period of 1,600 years. So that's pretty impressive in and of itself. And I would explain maybe real quick, but then I'm going to go to Josh. And Josh, think about, I want to ask you about your favorite book as a whole in the Old Testament, as well as more of what we're talking about. But the idea that the shadow and the substance, if you're standing around a corner of a building and someone's getting ready to come around that corner, they've got the sun behind them, the first thing you see is this shadow, right? That is appearing. And that's kind of the Old Testament, is that shadow. You get a general shape, a general idea, but you don't have all the facial features. You don't have all of the colors. You don't have all the details. You've just got this figure, this shadow of things. And that was the Old Testament as it was being revealed, but it was pointing to something that was still around the corner. And then when Christ came and the New Testament was revealed to us, then it's like whoever was casting that shadow has now stepped around the corner, and now you've got the full picture. You've got all the details, the facial features, the colors of the garments. You've got everything that wasn't revealed by that shadow now revealed in the New Testament. In Ephesians 3, verses 9 through 12, 9 through 11 anyway, talks about how that mystery of the Old Testament would now be made known through the church to the principalities and the powers. We have that manifold wisdom of God being made known through the church, through the New Testament, of what the Old Testament shadow was really all about. So with that, Josh, what is, first of all, what's your favorite Old Testament book, if you have one?
Oh, I guess that's a hard one.
He said.
I mean, I'd have spent quite a bit of time in Leviticus. I think there's a lot of value there that is often underappreciated.
Sure.
And it's one of those books that teaches us a lot if we're willing to listen to what it is that it's teaching us. From what I've heard, Jewish children, when they were first taught in their schools, the first book they were taught was Leviticus, because it would teach them about Jesus, or excuse me, about holiness. And so there's a lot of valuable lessons that we can learn there. More and more lately, I've been seeing a lot of connections from Isaiah. I think there's a lot of good things here in Isaiah that we can draw from. In fact, it's really interesting. You look at the beginning of a couple of the Gospels, Matthew and Mark, for instance. Matthew begins the genealogy of Jesus, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And what he's doing right there, and I mean, we might just overlook that and think, okay, this is the genealogy of Jesus. What he's doing is establishing his purpose for the gospel. He's trying to show us that throughout this gospel, he wants to establish that Jesus is the Son of God, that he is the legal heir to the throne, that he is the one who has all authority, as he concludes the gospel in Matthew 28. He's trying to emphasize Jesus is the fulfillment of those things. You come to Mark. Mark begins the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet. And I know he's quoting from Isaiah in just in the following verse, but if you could kind of just take that seems to be a bit of a purpose statement as well. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet. So what Mark is trying to do is show through Isaiah the gospel, and really show that Jesus is the fulfillment of what you read in the book of Isaiah. And I think there's a really cool connection that we can make, if my mouse will work here. You have in Isaiah 63, you have this section where Israel is kind of lamenting the fact that God is not with them. Verse 16, for instance, you are our father, though Abraham does not know us, and Israel does not recognize us. You, O Yahweh, are our father, our redeemer from everlasting is your name. Why, O Yahweh, do you cause us to stray from your ways and stiffen our heart from fearing you? It's just essentially, Israel had forsaken God. You go back to the very beginning of Isaiah, you see that, he says a dumb donkey knows its owner, but you don't even know the God who provided everything for you. And so basically, they're lamenting the fact that God does not know them anymore, and that's by their own doing, of course. But God is distant from them, and so in 64. And by the way, whoever put the chapter break here needs to be hanged for their crimes. This is a terrible place to put a chapter break. But anyway, chapter 64 and verse 1 says, "Oh, that you would rend the heavens and come down, that the mountains might quake at your presence." He's talking about opening up the heavens so that they could come down to the people, to bless the people, or to allow his presence to be shown to the people. I think there's a pointing back to Exodus 19 as God descends upon Mount Sinai, the quaking and the thundering and the lightning of the mountain there. And essentially they're saying, oh, tear open the heavens and come back down to us as you did there, as you established that covenant with us. Well, there's a really cool connection back in the book of Mark, chapter 1, where Jesus was baptized by John, verse 9. Then verse 10, immediately coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens opening and the Spirit like a dove descending upon him. Now, that is a very poor translation in the Gospel of Mark. And I guess the other ones do that as well. But it just says the heavens are opening, but it's really the idea of torn open, of, ripped open, and the Spirit descending upon him, and a voice came out of the heavens, "You are my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." And so Israel was asking God to rend the heavens and come down. And at Jesus' baptism, the heavens are rent open, if that's the proper way to say that. They're torn open, and the Spirit descends upon Jesus. And that's I did come down. And I am bringing a blessing to my people through Jesus. This is the Son that I've sent. I did come down. And so that I can restore you. I can reconcile you to myself. And so, again, you see a lot of really cool connections in Isaiah similar to that one. A lot of the things that you see in Mark are kind of pointing us back toward the things that Isaiah was talking about. So
Yeah.
I'm definitely interested in looking more in Isaiah and kind of getting a fuller picture of it. But
with what you've been saying, it kind of took my mind back to Acts chapter 8, where when Philip joined himself to the Ethiopian eunuch's chariot, right, and he's reading from the book of Isaiah, and he asked the question, who is this guy talking about? Is he talking about himself or someone else? And that not only it answers so many questions that have already been raised here, that we've talked about, as far as what's the value of the Old Testament? Why do we study the Old Testament? And that idea of the shadow, and pointing to the book of Isaiah as being such an awesome book. But here is the Ethiopian eunuch looking at Isaiah, and he sees this shadow, this figure of a man. But he's like, but what man is he talking about? Himself? Someone else? And then Philip, from that text, right? Isaiah 53, from that text, he preaches to him Christ and says, here's the full picture of what he was pointing to and what he was talking about. And so we see how the Old Testament is able to be used, right, to bring to light the full picture and say, this is what he was talking about. This is who he was pointing to. And because of the use of Isaiah, the Ethiopian eunuch was like, see, here is water. What hinders me from being baptized? And they commanded the chariot to stop, but went down the water, and he baptized him. And so we see that not only the value and such a great book in Isaiah, but how revealing that shadow that was being talked about, in Christ, will lead people to submitting themselves to the gospel of Christ. No doubt about it. Richard, you have another one?
Yeah, this is one I actually did a lesson on. I'm not on this particular verse, but it was included when I was talking about Jesus, and he made the road. He's the way maker. But in Isaiah 35:8, sometimes we have these passages that will apply to the Israelites as well as foretell something in the future.
Mm-hmm.
And this was one on Isaiah 35:8. And I like it because it gets into the characteristics of the road that Christ built. It says, a highway shall be there, and a road, and it shall be called the highway of holiness. The unclean shall not pass over it, but it shall be for others. And whoever walks the road, although a fool, shall not go astray. And so there's so much characteristics of that, talking about, the Christian way. It's there, that's encompassed right there, that, you can build off of. And of course, Paul made reference to the fact that, the message we preach is foolishness to men, but to us it's the word of God. But of course that's kind of what he's getting into. Although whoever walks the road, although a fool, shall not go astray, but the unclean shall not pass over it. A lot of people, they'll ask, do I really need to be baptized in order to be saved? Well, if you want to be on the highway of holiness, the unclean cannot pass over it. And so how are you going to get clean? That's a question you might have to ask yourself. And of course that leads to that leads to a whole bunch of stuff in the Old Testament that will also apply to the New. You mentioned the Passover, and that was the last plague of Egypt, how the blood of the lamb was put on the doorpost, so that when death came by, those who were inside that door, with the blood, the death would pass by. And of course, when Christ comes again with the vengeance of the Father, those who have been washed in the blood, who've been cleaned, those who've been washed in the blood of the Lamb, of course, will be spared. And so there's a lot of those kind of Isaiah 35:8, you can go a lot of different places with that. And that's just one verse. I mean, there's quite a number of them, but that's one that I used not too long ago. And I thought it was just revealing the characteristics of the way of Christ that were included, so long ago.
Sometimes the way God goes about delivering his message, you talk about unconventional to say the least. Hosea, for example. And you look at the first couple of chapters of the book of Hosea and what he's told to do. As far as marrying, right? He's to marry a harlot, and they're going to have kids, and they're going to name their kids Jezreel, Lo Ruhama, and Lo Ami, and all to make this point, right? That you're going to be scattered. You are not my people, and I will have no mercy upon you. But then they change the names, right? Well, Jezreel is no longer a scattering, but a sowing unto himself. He drops the Lo Ruhama and the Lo of Ruhama and Ami, and he says, I will have mercy. You will be my people. And of course, Peter, in his writings, alludes to that very same people, talking about, you will be my people, my chosen people. You will, I will show you mercy when you had no mercy. And he brings to light, kind of that illustration that God was making with Hosea. It's just, the things that he had people do, go and bury a sash next to the Euphrates River and come back to Jerusalem just to turn around, go get it and show the people, how ruined it was and that and worthless it is now, and saying that this is you. This is the kind of people you are to me because of your sin, because of what you have done and your neglect, and being thrown away, and this is what you've become. The valley of just all of these illustrations that he uses, and yet, we look at these passages, and perhaps, Josh, as you look at some of these texts, the thing that we often say today is, how could they not get it? How could they not understand? The children of Israel and wandering in the wilderness, oh, you brought us out here to die. We should go back to Egypt. And yet they're as Nehemiah chapter 9, verses 20 through 23 points out, their clothes didn't wear out, their sandals didn't wear out. They were brought along by God, and didn't need the things that normally you would have needed during this time, and yet they still look back to the bondage that they were in. And we think today, how could they not get it? And yet, if we examine ourselves, we'll find we're people too, right? We end up doing the same thing. But those lessons are there for our learning, no doubt about it. Go ahead, Josh.
Absolutely. And I mean, before we get too puffed up against them, we're just like them, and it might look different, but we're just like them. Another really cool story. You think about Hebrews 11, where it talks about the patriarchs. It mentions Joseph, and it says that he made mention concerning the Exodus. And you might wonder, why is Joseph mentioned there? We know the story of Joseph. He was sold by his brothers into slavery, ends up in Potiphar's house. He's falsely accused by Potiphar's wife, ends up in prison. He remains there for 2 years before he's called upon by Pharaoh to interpret his dream, and then he's exalted in the land of Pharaoh. And I think we have a tendency to maybe look at that section, Genesis chapter, is it 38? I have it right in front of me, but I still don't remember what the chapter was. Joseph interprets the dream in 41 and is set over Egypt in chapter 41. And I think it might be easy for us to look at that and think, yeah, Joseph has arrived. Joseph made it. And we can tell the story that, if you have faith like Joseph, you'll make it too. Joseph didn't see himself as having made it. If you look at the end of chapter 41, he names his firstborn son Manasseh, which means God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household. And the second was Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. Joseph is in a great place. He's been exalted. He's second in command over all of Egypt, and yet it's the land of his affliction. He's not home. And so as you come to the end of Joseph's life, he does make them swear that they would take his bones back to the promised land. It says there that he said, I'm about to die, verse 24 of chapter 50. But God will surely take care of you and bring you up from this land to the land which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob. And Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely take care of you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. I think the significance of Hebrews 11, where Joseph makes mention of the Exodus hadn't even happened yet. I mean, we're still a couple hundred years from the Exodus ever taking place, and Joseph saying, I want to be a part of it. I want to enjoy the promise of God. I want to be a part of the promise of God coming to fruition. And so Joseph didn't arrive in Egypt. He arrived when his bones were taken with the Israelites in the Exodus into the promised land. And so I think you've got a really cool picture there, and you get a really cool story and a lot more depth to the faith of Joseph than perhaps we might think if we just think Joseph arrived because he had faith. He had a lot more faith than sometimes we even give him credit for.
Yeah. Richard, you brought up the question earlier that you have been asked, why, what's so important? What's the value really of the Old Testament? Why do we study the Old Testament? And when you look at a text like in 1 Peter chapter 1, when he points out that these prophets didn't minister to themselves, but to us. And then you think about that question. In light of that question, Peter is saying that Old Testament was ministering to us. That's why we study it. That's why we look to it, because they weren't ministering to themselves, but to us. And so we ought to look and find out, what were they telling us? What were they teaching us? And learn those lessons. So you got any last ones, Richard? You got one more you want to bring up?
Well, I mean, I'll just make a comment on what Josh did. I kind of go along with what you just said. I mean, Joseph knew of the land promise. I mean, he knew of the promised land. And so he was looking toward that. And so, we have promises too contained in the scripture. And so, like Joseph, I mean, we should be looking upon here as the land of our affliction. This is where we have to suffer with sin. This is where we suffer with temptation. But there's a day coming when we will enter the promised land. And so, we should be looking, that should be our home. That should be something that we should think of as home, not here in this earth. And so, Joseph wanted his bones to be buried in the promised land. Well, I think it just kind of gives you an idea that that's where he wanted his resting place to be, and where we want our resting place to be would be with Jesus for all eternity. That's my final thought.
Josh, last thoughts?
Yes. We probably spend a lot of time in the New Testament, and there's nothing necessarily inherently bad about that. But we're not going to get the full picture if we don't have the Old Testament. There's a lot of things that the New Testament is going to talk about that is not really expanded upon. Sexual immorality, that's just one of the easy ones that just comes immediately to mind. And the New Testament condemns it, but it doesn't really define it. The Old Testament does. And there's a lot of things like that in the New Testament that are just kind of mentioned, expecting that you already have a knowledge of it. And you see the kind of rapid fire in Hebrews chapter 1, the kind of rapid fire quotations of the Old Testament. He expects that you know those in their context, what they're talking about, and now he's applying them to Jesus. Same thing with Jude 11, where he talks about the way of Cain and Korah and Balaam. He doesn't stop and expand on those and say, hey, this is what Cain did and what Korah did and what Balaam did. He just throws them out there expecting that you already know and makes application to them. And so we need the Old Testament to help us gain that fuller knowledge and understanding of the New Testament. There's a lot of value there. 2 Timothy 3:16 says all scripture is inspired by God and it's profitable to us, and that includes the Old Testament, and it includes the boring parts too. But so there's value there. Just spend time studying it, learning it, growing in it.
Absolutely.
Acts 2, they did the same thing.
Yep.
Peter, he quotes from Joel, and then he quotes from David, passages they were familiar with, and he was able to link that up with Christ, and all those people got baptized.
Yeah.
So yeah, they expect to know Revelation, written to the churches. That's right. Written to the 7 churches of Asia. How did they understand it unless they had a ready knowledge of the Old Testament?
Yep. Folks, we hope we've given you some things to think about and a good reason to go back and read and look at all of these accounts of the Old Testament and how they point to Christ in the New Testament and what it means for us. And so you got some favorite passages? Let us know. You got a favorite Old Testament book? Let us know about it. Send us an email. And if you have something you want us to talk about, you have a subject, a topic, you want us something that you would like for us to kind of deal with on the program, we'll be happy to take that under consideration as well. Shoot us an email at bereanspirits@gmail.com, and we'll be happy to take that under consideration and talk about some other Bible topics that maybe you guys are interested in. Until next time, though, remember to search the scriptures with Berean Spirits.
Well, folks, that's all for today. Don't worry. Lord willing, the guys will be back next week for another Bible study on Berean Spirits. Until then, let the guys hear from you. Drop them some email at bereanspirits@gmail.com. They'd love to hear from you. Until next time, let's keep studying that Bible.